2 months ago, I made a video that strongly disagreed with Rue of 16-Bit Gems about whether the term JRPG is used by people in a racist way to pigeonhole computer RPGs made by Japanese developers. While Rue took the position that stereotyping these games is not racist, I took the opposite position. And since making my original video that challenged these racist ideas, I have been harassed on a daily basis by an organized group of individuals, not only here on YouTube, but on Twitter, Facebook, and various other websites they can find me. They have sought to invalidate my arguments by attacking my character and making several slanderous statements that distort the things I have said and done. Essentially, rather than debate the actual issues, they have decided to debate everything else. So, whereas my original video was an unscripted rant, I have scripted this new video to cut straight to the heart of the matter, with no room for discussion about anything else. Now, some may question why I have made these videos at all, as some have claimed I am simply looking for attention. However, this is not the case. The reason I have taken this strong stance is because it is important to challenge the assertions made by these individuals, because the ideas they have are not only morally wrong, but spread a dangerous ideology that declares it is okay to aggressively act upon racist ideas and destroy people for daring to challenge them. Their behavior toward me for the past 2 months mirrors that of other dangerous hate groups, and as those groups had to be challenged, so too does this group need to be. First, let us establish what racism is. Rather than use a dictionary, I am going to invoke a definition that is universally acknowledged across the world. The United Nations definition of racism, as specified in Resolution 1206, and it is as follows. Any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. This definition has been the way the United Nations has defined racism for the past 4 decades. Some individuals will disagree with this assertion, claiming discrimination against other nationalities should be more properly be called xenophobia. However, like the UN, I think it's simpler to call a spade a spade. Xenophobia is merely a form that racial discrimination often takes. Now, before we jump into the JRPG issue, let me show you an example of a statement that is well regarded to be a negative racist stereotype, and let me explain why it is so. Firstly, the statement is a logical fallacy. While it is likely that you can find African Americans who like chicken, watermelon, and basketball, it is also true you can find many African Americans who do not like these things. So, the statement is based on the incorrect assumption that because some members of a group like a thing, the majority must like it. This would be like suggesting all Americans like hamburgers and pizza, which absolutely cannot be true because many Americans are vegetarians. The second problem with the statement that all African Americans like these things is that these 3 items are pointed out to the exclusion of others, implying that African Americans liking these things is unique. After all, why point out these traits at all if everyone likes them? There would be no need to point them out. So the person who is making this statement is suggesting there is something unique about African Americans liking these things. And the unique idea they are implying is that African Americans liking these things is a negative thing. That African Americans are uncultured. Indeed, the reason African Americans liking sports is singled out is only to express the idea that African American culture de-emphasizes academic achievement. Therefore, the stereotype that African Americans like chicken, watermelon, and sports is an attempt to dehumanize African Americans and make them the subject of ridicule. However, the basis for the stereotype is incredibly flawed. I'm not African American, and I like fried chicken, watermelon, and sports. So do many thousands of people who are not of African American descent. So this assumption that African Americans liking these things and others don't like them is mistaken, as are all the other conclusions the speaker is trying to imply by pointing out African Americans like fried chicken, watermelon, and sports. So why then do people present these flawed arguments again and again? Why do they promote the stereotypes if they fall apart so easily under close logical examination? The reason is because presenting logical fallacies is a common misinformation tactic that tends to be effective in debates because a logical fallacy is partly true. You see, because there is some truth to the allegations, and the audience knows that, the audience convinces themselves that because some of the statements are true, that means the conclusions must be true as well. Thus, a logical fallacy assembles true statements in a way to misguide people toward an irrational conclusion, essentially tricking the audience into believing a lie they otherwise would not believe. Now let us look at the statement Rue made in his video about JRPGs that I took issue with, that JRPGs are largely turn-based, have simple character growth systems, and linear storylines. Let's examine each statement closely, the same way we examined the statements about African Americans. Firstly, turn-based? While it is true that many JRPGs have turn-based combat systems, the reason the individual is pointing this fact out is to imply that computer RPGs made elsewhere in the world, namely the West, do not. So the statement is true, but the conclusion it leads the audience toward is false, and one does not need to look hard to see it is false. For the majority of well-known WRPG series consist of games with turn-based combat systems. Additionally, there are a large number of JRPGs that are action RPGs. Indeed, there are multiple well-known JRPG franchises whose games have real-time combat systems. This is not unsurprising considering that the majority of major video game consoles are manufactured by Japanese companies, resulting in the Japanese computer video game industry having a great deal of competition. If all the computer RPGs they made were truly so similar to one another, there would be no way for the developers to compete with one another. Therefore, because there are many JRPG titles that have real-time combat systems, we can safely conclude that the statement JRPGs are largely turn-based is false. But why do they focus on turn-based combat at all? It is my opinion the reason they make an issue out of turn-based combat systems is because the journalists have the grossly mistaken idea that a turn-based combat system demands less system resources than a real-time combat system. Therefore, games with turn-based combat cannot be cutting edge, because it does not take full advantage of modern consoles' hardware. On a related note, these same journalists say the same thing about the use of 2D graphics. The reality is that such attitudes demonstrate extraordinary ignorance about not only game design, but game programming, and is one of the reasons why I have previously suggested that game journalists have some amount of education in these topics. At any result, the idea that JRPGs are not cutting edge because they are turn-based is wrong on two accounts. Turn-based combat systems can place a heavy toll on a modern gaming console, and many hundreds of JRPG titles do not feature turn-based combat systems. The next statement, that JRPGs have simple character systems, is equally false. The statement is made to suggest that games made elsewhere in the world, such as the West, have more complex character systems. However, the majority of well-known WRPG franchises feature games with character systems no more complex than Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, whose record-keeping and math is meant to be done on the fly by humans. Many WRPGs may allow a player to choose the sex of the character, but the sex generally doesn't impact gameplay, and the actual parameters of the character are decided by the race and class combo the player chooses. In comparison, many JRPGs use highly complex algorithms, and feature very unique combat systems that are rarely reproduced by American developers. The last statement, that JRPGs mostly feature linear storylines, is also false. There are many examples of JRPGs who have non-linear elements to their narratives. The statement is also false because linear narratives are pointed out as being unique to JRPGs, suggesting games made elsewhere in the world, such as the West, have non-linear narratives. But it is a fact that many games belonging to the most well-known WRPG franchises don't have non-linear elements in their gameplay, or at least not any more than the non-linear elements that appear in JRPG counterparts. So again, this statement is also incorrect. Additionally, there are multiple kinds of non-linear narratives. For even some games with largely linear narratives like Chrono Trigger and Disgaea have some non-linear elements to them, such as offering the player multiple endings. Even some of the Final Fantasy games, like 6 and 7, have choices for the player that slightly impact the direction of the narrative. Personally, I have identified two different types of nonlinear narratives. Dynamic nonlinear narratives, where the player makes choices during gameplay that shape the game's narrative in meaningful and critical ways so as to substantially change the direction of the game's narrative. There are either no or very few milestone events that the player must clear in order for the narrative to advance. Examples of a dynamic nonlinear narrative would be Fallout and Romancing Saga Minstrel Song. The other, much more common type is the static nonlinear narrative, where the choices made by the player do not alter the narrative in significant ways, and the narrative generally travels in a single direction with few deviations. This kind of narrative is built around milestone events which must be passed through regardless of whether choices the player makes. The game's narrative simply cannot move forward if these milestones are not cleared. Examples would be Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Shin Megami Tensei Persona 4. For those interested, I have a more in-depth explanation of these types of nonlinear narratives in my blog. Check the video description to find the link. Anyway, at this point of the debate, there are bound to be people who will argue JRPGs are a unique genre because of game graphics, suggesting that the so-called anime style allows one to visually define the games as being Japanese. However, the reality is that the graphics of a video game are selected to appeal to the target audience the game is to be marketed toward. Regardless of culture, round and colorful characters are popular with younger audiences, and more realistic designs are more popular with adult audiences. It happens to be that many of the newer WRPGs whose artwork is defined as realism are aimed at adult audiences, while the majority of JRPGs are aimed at children and teenagers. This can be seen in the sheer volume of M-rated WRPGs compared to the overwhelming E and T-rated JRPGs. If you don't believe that the ratings of a game matter, then you don't understand how the entertainment industry works. A teenager can't buy an M-rated game, but can buy a T-rated game. If a game publisher believes the target audience for the game is teenagers, they will remove content from their games to ensure that the games are rated T and not M. This is very close to how the film industry works. But the real sticker is that one individual will claim a game like Final Fantasy XIII has anime graphics, but go on to say that a game like Dragon Age Origins is realism. In reality, there is very little difference between the graphical styles of these games. The very last argument these racists will make is that it is okay to pigeonhole these games as JRPGs because the Japanese also use the term to describe their industry. But this is like a member of the KKK saying it is okay to call African Americans niggers, because nigga has become a slang word in the African American community. The fact is that racists do not use the term the way that African Americans do, nor do the Japanese use the term JRPG to mean computer RPGs with turn-based combat, simple character systems, linear narratives, anime graphics, and gameplay that is inferior to games made by the West. Personally, I believe the term nigger is not salvageable at all, for any use of it brings to mind a dark time in the history of the United States, and invokes strong negative emotions. I do not really like to see it commonly used by anyone, and I believe that the terms JRPG and WRPG are heading into that kind of direction. I fear that one day these terms are not going to be salvageable because of the racist beliefs people are expressing when they use them. Another problem with trying to narrowly define computer RPGs is that, much like their human creators, they are simply too diverse to pigeonhole. Each game must be evaluated on its own merits as individual titles and not judged wholly by their origins. Those who wish to pigeonhole these games into two unique categories based on nation of origin are not giving these games a fair and balanced evaluation. Those who apply the terms JRPG and WRPG are trying to misrepresent the industries as being at war with one another, assembling all games made by Americans, Germans, Britons, Canadians, and French as belonging to the West, and being innovative, while the thousands of highly diverse Japanese titles are pigeonholed with the label JRPG and called outdated and simple. It is racism and it is wrong. So why does this matter, you may ask? Well, I believe it matters because when people dismiss games of Japanese origin simply on that basis, it negatively impacts the sales of these games, hurting the developers of the game as they need to make back the money they spent developing the games in order to continue paying their employees. Loss of sales due to consumers and game reviewers pigeonholing these games and not giving them as equal consideration as they would give to titles from the West is hurting their industry. Another reason why this issue matters is because video games are works of art, created by artists. All of them deserve to be properly recognized, not stereotyped. And their creators don't deserve the insulting, hastily thrown together reviews that many game journalists give them based on the first 10 minutes of gameplay, because the reviewers have such disdain for these titles they won't even review them properly. And Japanese computer RPGs certainly do not deserve to have misinformation articles written about them that herald the death of the JRPG industry due to unfounded accusations like a lack of depth and innovation compared to Western titles. In truth, there is no death of the JRPG industry. These articles are written with a xenophobic outlook to promote an us versus them mentality that is rooted in racism that I believe has its foundations in fanboy favoritism of Microsoft's Xbox brand. Sadly, this unwarranted dislike of the Japanese game industry is an unfortunate side effect of the fierce competition the video game industry is known for. I wish it were that all game journalists abided by a universal code of ethics and were immune to blind fanboyism of developers and publishers, but the truth is that, currently, to be a game journalist does not require any special training. To be considered a professional game journalist, one need only an opinion, a loud voice, and a small internet fan base. This field of journalism is still in its infancy, and all the problems that entails. Therefore, because there are prominent game journalists who do not abide by any ethical standards, I believe it is important to confront their racism head-on If our industry is ever to become a respectable source of accurate and fair information about video games as works of art, there is no place for the immature, homophobic statements many gamers make, nor is there a place for their racist attitudes towards games made by the Japanese, who compete with Microsoft's Xbox. Nobody called these games JRPGs and collectively pigeonholed them as being inferior products to games made elsewhere in the world when it was only Sega vs. Nintendo or Nintendo vs. Sony. Now that the game console market is Nintendo vs. Sony vs. Microsoft, the attitudes of many gamers have shifted to viewing the competitive landscape as a battle between the West and the Japanese, as if the days of World War II were not long behind us. So I find their attitudes and beliefs not only unprofessional, but unacceptable, and I will challenge them again and again, and I strongly encourage others to do so as well to halt these ideologies from gaining any further ground in our culture. Personally, I do not believe that Rue of 16-Bit Gems is intentionally spreading racist ideas. I believe that, like many others, he was simply echoing statements made by other game journalists for the past several years. Game journalists who, I do believe, are intentionally misrepresenting games of Japanese origin to better position themselves with Western developers who they rely more heavily on for ad revenue. That said, it falls on my responsibility to point out that some of the people who have these strong but incorrect beliefs about JRPGs don't intentionally mean any harm by it. But that's the thing that makes racist beliefs so dangerous. Some people have a way of convincing themselves that their racist beliefs aren't racist because they don't mean any harm. They have convinced themselves that because their beliefs are based on half-truths, that their opinions are valid reflections of reality. Unfortunately, all racist beliefs are grounded in logical fallacies, and will fall apart when closely examined by rational, critical thinking. I realize that my opinion on this matter is not currently popular in the gaming press, but I accept that. This is how I see things, and I cannot see them any other way. And I will not be bullied into silencing my dissent by those who would misrepresent my positions and slander my reputation in order to detract from the facts that have led me to form my opinion about this matter. There is a perception in the general public that gamers are immature and propagate homophobic and chauvinistic ideas, and sadly there is some truth to these allegations because of the conduct of members of the gaming community, especially certain individuals in the gaming press who lash out with homophobic and sexist slurs when they become upset. However, we gamers are as diverse as the games we play. If those of us who do not share these immoral ideologies don't protest to make our voices heard, then our hobby and our industry will continue to be painted in such a stereotypical way by the major media outlets. It is said that if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything, and I will ever stand against those who wish to judge people and their art based on what nationality the artist comes from, rather than the individual merits of the artwork they created. If you are going to use the term JRPG, then you should only use it to mean the Japanese computer RPG industry and nothing more. You cannot use it to define a unique genre of games different than those produced elsewhere in the world, and you certainly cannot claim that all games made by Americans, Canadians, British, French, and German game developers are a collective genre called WRPG. That's just silly. While it is true that all computer RPGs share some common elements, the individual games themselves have too much diversity to fall under only two subcategories, especially when the only criteria for belonging to the subcategory is what country the game originated in. To claim otherwise is to propagate lies that are based on half-truths and cause needless harm to our community and industry. Besides, this is the year 2011, not 1945. Judging the merits of people and their work based only on their nation of origin is an idea that should have long since been abandoned when 50 million people died when the world went to war over the matter. Such viewpoints have no place in the society we live in today, and I will not pretend that they do.